Well, welcome everyone. My name's Arthur Romano, and I am an associate professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and the director of our program on urban peace building. And today we have an exciting program, and I'm happy to welcome you all. First, let me welcome you to Peace Week. We organize Peace Week twice a year, this time in the spring, and then also around the International Day of Peace on September 21st. So if you're joining us now and this is your first time, you can come check us out in the fall as well. And we tend to have over 40 or 50 sessions on a wide range of topics with peace builders and folks who are doing positive work around the world. This session is part of our program on urban peace building, sponsored by our program on urban peace building. And so I wanted to just frame this session in those terms. According to the United Nations, approximately 55% of the world's population lived in urban areas in 2018, and that figure is projected to increase to 68% by 2050. And so the overwhelming majority of humanity will live in cities and already lives in cities. And at their best, cities offer really complex spaces that amplify the creative and cultural capital of residents and serve as a crossroads for people from a wide array of backgrounds from all over the world. And in a rapidly urbanizing world, vibrant cities are at the core of ensuring the health and well-being of billions of people. And while cities can be a place of connection and collaboration and exchange, they can also be deeply divided along economic, racial, ethnic, religious, and other lines of social difference. As highlighted by a UN Habitat report in 2016, 75% of the world's cities have higher levels of income inequality than 2 decades ago. So the overwhelming majority and trending in that direction. So the promise of mobility, of creativity, of innovation are not shared by all residents in cities equally. And deep divisions in cities breed pervasive and systemic exclusion and can intensify violent social dynamics in urban areas. So that story about conflict and violence in cities, though, is only part of the story. Cities are dynamic places of convergence and the birthplace of cutting-edge ideas. And this goes back millennium. Leading political ideas about how we can organize ourselves, the confluence of music and art, and focused social and political exchange has always taken place, not solely, but largely in cities. And so today I'm so excited because we have folks who are doing that kind of creative work, that are lifting up the stories of people in communities and bringing them forward in ways that otherwise people might not have a chance to connect with their stories. We here at the program are beginning our podcast called the Peace City Podcast that's going to explore exactly these issues around the city. And so we're excited to learn from our friends here who are further down the road. And hopefully for those of you who are doing community building work in your own places all over the place, all over the world, you'll grab some inspiration from the conversation today as well. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Carter School, to our Peace Week, and to our first session that's focused on digital media and podcasting it. And so I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Will McKerney. And it's a pleasure to have you all with us today.
Thanks so much, Arthur, and thanks to the Carter School and to the program on urban peace building for hosting us, and a big thanks to all of y'all for joining the discussion. My name is Will McInerney. I'm a postdoc at the London School of Economics, where I work on the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub, and I'm also a visiting scholar here at the Carter School. And relevant to today in this conversation, I'm also a poet, a storyteller, and a peace practitioner who's used spoken word in peace education, who's used storytelling and podcasting and peace and gender justice research. And I've also worked as a radio journalist covering issues of conflict and crisis and revolution in the US, North Africa, and the Middle East, using radio as a way to amplify the voices of agents of change. And as Arthur mentioned, today's session is going to include 4 presentations from our esteemed panelists that y'all get to know in just a bit: Nikki Armstrong, Vernice Hurd, Carrie McInerney, and Kamaya Truitt. followed by an open discussion and Q&A with the panelists, Arthur, myself, and importantly with you all so that we can discuss these key issues. And the theme for Peace Week for the spring 2024 is transforming conflict and enhancing social impact. And we're going to try to unpack those big ideas through this session by asking how might digital storytelling, including podcasting, as well as other visual, audio, and immersive social media and online platforms, how can this kind of digital peace building work support the vital efforts of conflict transformation and social justice in our cities? And so to kind of kick this thing off, to provide some context, I want to share kind of 3 quick reasons why I think this session is important for the wider field of peace building. And the first one is that peace building is, like the rest of the world and our daily lives, increasingly becoming digital. And while it is often clear how technology can be used as an instrument and a facilitator of violence, we must also examine the potential for the opposite. How can technology amplify, democratize, and accelerate our peace building work? A second key point is focused on the urban context itself. As Arthur noted, the world is undergoing what some have called the largest wave of urbanization in human history. More than half of our planet lives in a city today, and that number is rising fast. This means that peace and justice in our cities and the distinct challenges and opportunities that come with it are of vital importance to all peace builders and to those working for social change. So just as peace building is increasingly digital, so too is it urbanized. And lastly, the key component here, and as I noted in my introduction, I'm personally invested in this discussion because I believe that storytelling matters and it's inseparable from our peace building work. Storytelling is arguably the oldest of human traditions. As the Carter School Professor Emeritus Sarah Cobb has argued, stories are the architecture of our consciousness. They shape the way we think, the way we speak, the way we act. And as peace educator scholar Mary Lee Morrison writes, storytelling is that kind of almost intangible human capacity. It is, she says, what actually makes us human. Stories are the social and emotional glue that holds us together, but they can also be the wedge that drives us apart. Storytelling is not good or bad. It is powerful. It is the way we make our way through the world. It can be a means of inciting violence, of spreading misinformation, or of promoting hate and intolerance. But it can also be an instrument of peace, of amplifying the voices of those around us, of bringing forth those whose stories are silenced, of educating for and about peace, and of shining a light on injustice. And we can start to see how digital peace building, urbanization, and storytelling are emerging in our field. Podcasting is just one way that shows up. Peace-focused podcasts grow in number on my podcast feed by the day, it feels like. You have On Peace from USIP, Peace We Build It from the Alliance on Peace Building, the Croccast, Prio's Peace in the Pod, Seeking Peace from Georgetown, Think and Resist from WILF, the Gender Justice and Security Hub, where I work, just released their own Gender Hubcast, and of course, as Arthur mentioned, the new Peace in the City podcast from the Carter School, just to name a few. There is a growing base of discussions of digital stories being told about peace. And digital storytelling can democratize access to information. Who gets to tell stories? How many people hear them? Shining a brighter light on injustices. I experienced this on a personal level recently. Just last week, a dear friend of mine, a colleague, was working on a medical humanitarian mission in Gaza, working from an utterly destroyed city, a place where journalists are not allowed in. And yet people have found ways to get stories out. Gazan journalists risking their lives and sharing clips on Instagram and TikTok, phone calls recorded and then broadcasts on podcasts around the world, WhatsApp messages as lifelines to the outside. And a couple nights in the past week, my friend sent videos, and one night he described the humanitarian devastation. He pleaded, he demanded from the hospital he was working at for the international community to see and to do something. And the last thing he said, something that will always stay with me, I think, is he said that no one can say they did not know what is happening here. Even in some of the hardest to reach places in the world right now, in Gaza, in Sudan, in all places, in all corners of our planet, In urban spaces that are bombed to rubble, today, now, we can hear more of those voices. We can see more of their stories, and that's powerful. And with that comes responsibility, responsibility to bear witness, to act as peace builders. What can, should, must we do in these moments now that we know more? What stories will we share and amplify? What stories will we tell? How can they shape, as Sarah Cobb teaches us, our thinking, our teaching, our practice? As digital storytelling democratizes the information architecture of our world, of our peace studies field, of our classrooms, how can we use these stories to further the cause of peace and justice? So peace building is becoming increasingly digital. The world is becoming more urbanized, and storytelling, I would argue, is a powerful peace building process to help us make sense of it all. At the intersection of these 3 points emerge new questions, opportunities, and importantly, challenges and risks too. And that's why we are here today. And so with that, I say let's start the discussion. And I'm very excited to hear from Nikki, from Bernice, from Carrie, and Kamaya. The 4 panelists are going to speak about their experiences as podcasters, as journalists, as communication professionals, and digital story creators. They're also going to speak from the perspective as researchers who sometimes examine the intersections of technology, storytelling, and social justice. But importantly, they, like all of us, are also people who are impacted by these stories. They are listeners of podcasts. They are advocates for social change in the many ways that it shows up in our world. And so with that being said, I want to jump into our first panelist today, who is Nikki Armstrong. Nikki is a co-investigator and a communications consultant on the Gender Justice and Security Hub at the London School of Economics. Her work focuses on digital storytelling and narrative creation to bridge the gap between expert understandings of social issues and the wider public. Nikki is also a PhD student at Queen Mary University, London, investigating the role of visual communication alongside storytelling and testimony within feminist movements, looking at the ways in which these stories are strategically crafted and visualized realities have been used as powerful tools for new ideas and values to be introduced, infused, and then circulated back and onto political agendas. And with that being said, Nikki, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Will. You made me sound so fancy there. It's so lovely to be here with you all, and thank you so much for inviting us, Arthur and Will, for setting up this panel. So yeah, as Will said, I'm coming from this as a communications professional, so I feel slightly daunted to be in such good company as somebody who's not producing a podcast, but is very much listening to your podcasts. So I want to kind of speak at more of an overview level. So through this comms lens, I suppose, thinking about my background, and specifically thinking about storytelling as communication. So whilst my work sits in peace building and, inclusive of that is urban peace building as well, and in some of the work that the Gender Justice and Security Hub is doing there as well, particularly around migration and flows into urban cities and contexts. But I'm actually going to speak about the layers of storytelling rather than a specific peace building topic today. And yeah, so as Will alluded to, I work a lot with digital storytelling. So to tell stories around research specifically, given that I sit in an academic institution, but not just research, so also activism. And when you combine research with activism and this practical element to the research. And so very much focusing on peace building and gender justice and a range of social justice work, which sits within those categories. So in my work, and I think I was reflecting when Will asked me to do this talk, I was kind of thinking, okay, where do I sit within this? And I was thinking, what do I constantly hear myself talking about? And I constantly hear myself advocating for using visuals, which isn't something within research that is a given, right? So obviously there's a great body of arts-based research and methodologies happening, but it's not always taken as a given that you will use visual mediums in the work. And so with that, I'm always kind of arguing for this use of visuals, for this movement, this color, this texture, this flow, and, thinking about how we can reframe narratives by, combining information with testimony and and with stories and visuals around a range of justice issues that are collectively important for peace. And then, you know, the next layer to that, which is what Will was also expertly talking about when he introduced this session, was thinking about how we can harness technologies and digital spaces to bring those narratives to life, and, you know, thinking about information flow and how we can reveal new information, reveal new visuals, how we reveal new audio and findings and recommendations, in the flow of that story. And so always for me, with a view to how visuals can, you know, slowly challenge how we view and think of politics and peace. And I think also further than that, to enable us to think that a different social reality is possible. And I think these stories and these visuals, I think they speak to kind of the broken reality in a different way than words, or certainly they do for me personally. And I think they can prompt us to rethink some of our assumptions about the world. And I think in that sense, you know, I'm always advocating that storytelling isn't just about transmission comms. And when I say that, I mean kind of from the author to the viewer, but it's also about trying to shape our realities too, to work towards justice and community building and reframing how we can actually do that work. So everything I've just said in my rambling intro is premised on something crucial, which you've probably noticed how many times I've used the words visual. And so everything here has been premised on this information being visual. It's based on visual behavior. It's based on visual stimulation, visual recall. And the visual is always a component here, even if it's not the only one. So personally, for me, the visual has been key to my understanding of the political, but also the types of insights and understandings they facilitate for me. So I think they can be a different approach to thought and knowledge and evidence that can feel more inclusive at times. And I'm personally not somebody that copes well, or probably actively doesn't want to cope well with, you know, the academic thought, with the crafting of words into longer text, with the theory. And I just want to kind of crack on and see it all, and, you know, be given short, compelling narratives that I can digest, and I don't need to carve out an hour of quiet time to engage with it. But then I'm going to undo everything I've just said and push back on my own narrative here, and actually think about, you know, what place does the visual hold alongside storytelling, when you have testimony, when you have witnessing alongside that, and what happens to storytelling if you remove the visual. And I think, is it then and only then that we really see, that we really hear, that we really listen? And actually, I think you could go even further than this, and this is something that I'm currently exploring, is like, when is it important that you actively remove the visual from digital storytelling? And I think, when is it strategically important to replace images with sound and with voice only, so that you really do see? And so I was thinking about, how is listening, you know, fundamentally different from seeing, when I was preparing for the talk today, and how is it fundamentally different from reading and from writing and rationalizing events in that way? And then it started to prompt me to think, you know, about the different senses, and how in storytelling or politics and peace and justice work that we're all involved in, how you need to draw on this full range of human senses. And I think for me, to loop back to podcasting, this is, you know, it's done that so well for me. I think this is something that podcasting does really well. And I think it's this combination of voice, this combination of sound, music, escapism, this casual tone, this conversation, this interaction, and the truism, I think, to the way that we talk, the way that we think, with the way we feel and express, and it keeps it emotive and personal. But then on top of this, what it's doing is it's turning everyday talk into a source of, it's, you know, it's not only information gathering and knowledge production in the context of research, which within I sit, but it's also turning everyday talk into a source of politics and activism and a communication in and of itself, which it should be recognized as, and it should be recognized as a labor as well. So I think these stories are invaluable insights, you know, into the global structures and the systems, and they engage with lived realities. And I think, for me personally, are more transformative and applicable because of that. So, I mean, one of the questions is, does this make them more effective at building community and organizing and mobilizing across physical and digital divides? You can probably tell from my talk where I sit on that, and I'm a strong bias of yes, I think it does. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute and I'm actually going to share a clip. So I'm going to share a clip that I think achieves everything that I've just said so well. So it's called The Birth of American Music, and it's from the podcast 1619 by the New York Times. And so it's looking at the history of slavery and its ongoing legacies in the US. And the particular episode looks at the connections between slavery, Black music, and popular culture. And to take a quote from the podcast episode itself, if I may, is that for centuries, Black music has been an expression of artistic freedom. No wonder everybody is always stealing it. And I think to teach about peace, we need to think about addressing legacies and the ongoing structural harms and violences of these. And I think this is a great series that really rings true to that. And for me, what this particular episode does so masterfully is, aside from being a story that should be told time and time again, it's in the post-production for me, and it's in the sound editing that ensures that I, as a white person, give justice to this topic when I listen to it. And it works to hold my attention. It moves me through all the emotions when I listen to this podcast. So it makes, you know, the narratives in this podcast, they really rise and fall from moments of joy and memories of certain songs that they're playing to me, you know, which is really troublesome and problematic given the context of this podcast, to moments of sadness and seriousness and harsh reality. And it makes me see what I should be seeing in all of our cultural references. So I'm going to ask Will, Tech Will, to play my clip. But before I do so, I was going to ask you all to turn off your cameras. Most of you have them off anyways. That's great. But if my fellow panelists could turn off the cameras and close your eyes whilst you listen to this clip.
And then I started thinking about all these other singers I love. I'm thinking about Amy Winehouse. I'm thinking about Annie Lennox. I'm thinking about George Michael. I think about Chris Stapleton, who practices a kind of muscly blues that gets written off his country because he's a big white guy in a hat. And one of the many phases in which David Bowie really wanted to make R&B and soul music. This is the sound not just of Black America, but the sound of America. It is deeply American, almost especially when it's sung by British people like David Bowie and Annie Lennox and Amy Winehouse. And it fills me with pride. Like, I know that there is something irresistible and ultimately inevitable about Black music being a part of American popular music. But it also reminds me that there's a history to this, a very painful history. And in the most perversely ironic way, it's this historical pain that is responsible for this music. Some of the oldest recordings we have of Black American music are from the 1930s. And they're songs that would have been sung by Americans born into slavery.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to that clip. And so I suppose the message here for me is that, you know, a great story that everybody should hear, understand, learn from, take forward is great, but sometimes it's not enough on its own. And I think how you communicate that story matters. Why you place that audio cut in that place, why you transition from that song to the next, why you move from joy to sadness back to joy matters. And I think how you place this in a cultural frame of reference matters. And just one final point from me, I promise, is also, I don't want to over theorize this either, that sometimes podcasts and stories are just good places to go to escape, to tune into something you find interesting, funny, comforting, to pass the time whilst you're commuting. And so I also advocate for moments of silence as well, moments to turn off that podcast. Sorry, I know we're about to have a presentation on podcasts, but yeah, moments to turn off that podcast, to to stop reading that story, to hide from social media, that video, to close that website page, which seems the antithesis of everything that I've just said. And my role as a communications professional, I'll be putting myself out of a job. But I think we're in a world now where silence has become deafening, and we need to reframe that and actually pausing from stimulating every single one of our senses all of the time and sit with what we've heard, talk about, seen, felt in a day is important to building more reflection and thought into our response to the kind of issues we're discussing here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that talk, Nikki, and for her kicking off our conversation. With that, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into our next speaker. Vernice Hurd is a George Mason Carter School Shinyo Fellow, and she earned her BA in Conflict Analysis and Resolution at the Carter School in 2023, just last year. While at Mason, Vernice focused on issues relating to incarceration, including solitary confinement, zero tolerance policies, the school to prison pipeline, and racial minimization in the legislative trajectory of the Crown Act. Throughout her time at Mason, Vernice has found her passion in advocating for those impacted by the U.S. justice system. With her Shinyo Fellowship, Vernice now works with the Prisons and Justice Initiative at Georgetown University, primarily focusing on supporting reentry programs offered to returning citizens in Washington, D.C. And with that, I'm very honored to pass it over to you, Vernice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Will, for that lovely introduction. So I really wanted to touch on the topic of the voices that we listen to when it comes to peace building, especially within urban areas. So basically, the person that I really like to focus on is Stanley Tookie Williams, who was the co-founder of the Crips gang, which is very prolific within the state of California and what some may say other parts of the United States, just in a different form and by a different name. One of the things that's very interesting about Stanley Tookie Williams is that although he was serving the death sentence for committing 4 murders, he was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 5 times, and he was also nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature once. Unfortunately, he was executed in 2005, but there was a very large discussion on how his contribution to peace actually was a form of evidence or a projection of his reformation while he was incarcerated. And what I really think is important about this discussion is that while Tookie Williams was serving time, he wrote multiple children's books about his experience in gang life, but also just about the overall experience that one may get if they were to choose that sort of lifestyle. So I would really welcome you all to watch this clip. It is from, I believe, a 60-minute interview. And the discussion is basically surrounding the perspectives that people were having when they chose to nominate Mr. Stanley Williams as a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and why some may say that his contributions, such as the children's books, along with times speaking at schools for the time that he was given on the phone, they're saying that, they're not sure if they're able to trust that this is a genuine cause that he is supporting. So I will give it to Will to play that short clip.
California professor of philosophy, Philip Gasper.
Here is somebody with so few resources, but through strength of personality and perseverance, he has managed to have this enormous impact. I think he's an incredible role model.
But, this is a man who's been convicted of 4 murders. There's no question about the founding of the Crips, the violence and life of mayhem that he led. I don't understand how you then nominate someone like that for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, there's no question that he has had, a violent past. But you know, the same is true of some other people that have won the Nobel Peace Prize as well. Henry Kissinger was awarded it in 1973, and you know, many people would claim that he's a war criminal. F.W. de Klerk got it with the end of apartheid. He'd supervised that system of racism and oppression. But the Nobel Peace Prize isn't awarded for what your past is like. You don't have to have an unblemished past. It's awarded on the basis of, have you made a contribution towards peace? And that, I think, is what is true of Stanley Williams.
Not according to Vernell Crittenden, a San Quentin prison official who's been monitoring Stanley Williams for 23 years, ever since he arrived on death row.
I am aware that he has been nominated. I've actually had the opportunity to spend several hours with Mother Teresa when she visited here at San Quentin, as I was one of her personal escorts through the prison. And Stanley Williams is no Mother Teresa.
What do you think he's...
Thank you so much, Will, for playing that. So although the clip is about 13 minutes long, there was a lot more discussion on where people were seeing, what people were thinking that Stanley's intentions were as he was writing these children's books from inside the prison, and also volunteering as a guest speaker for, you know, teenagers in high school within the state of California also. But I think what's very important to this discussion, especially since I did not submit a podcast, I think it's the thing about podcasting and storytelling, especially in today's age when it comes to urban topics, is that it's coming straight from people who have direct experience from urban conflict. And I feel like that is what is most important to people like me who have an urban background, and to people that who I've grown up with and may have chosen to go a different route with their life. And I think one of the most pressing things about the day and age now is that the youth and urban youth are wanting a voice and a say on their narrative and how they are presenting themselves. But will be times where they will not present themselves in a way that, a peace-building professional may do so. However, that does not mean they don't have an experience and a perspective on how they can build peace in their community. Stanley Tukey Williams, at the end of the video, what is very interesting is that there was also the topic of how he was consistently advocating on his innocence and for his appeal from the death sentence. And although people were saying like the Nobel Peace Prize and the nominations would be used to help his appeal or help his clemency from the death sentence, people who are actually would be considered to be a part of the Crips gang in California, very influential people within those neighborhoods, such as Snoop Dogg, have said, there is a way that people can reform. And what I find from digital storytelling and from podcasting today is that the people who may have also lived that form of lifestyle of crime, or may have also lived a lifestyle that is not so peaceful, they also have something to say about why they did what they did, and why sometimes they might not even speak on the morals of someone else because they have an understanding from that community that everyone is just surviving. And then there are also deep-rooted political attributes as to the conflicts that are happening within their community. And those conflicts are so deep-rooted that a lot of times we talk about slavery, but the concept of slavery within those communities is so deep-rooted that oftentimes people aren't really paying attention to just slavery or, just things such as the civil rights movement. They're paying attention to situations such as gang violence and such as incarceration, because that is a trauma that they are, currently experiencing even today. This topic has also been brought up in multiple other podcasts that I listen to in my free time, such as the Don't Call Me White Girl podcast, which is hosted by Damona, and she's from North Philly. I'm from Delaware, so for me, listening to her speak in a way that is not so theoretical and not so, no offense to anyone who has a peace building scholarship in here, but I think her voice is very important because for her, when she steps into these spaces, understanding that she may not have the credentials as a peace building academic, she understands she knows that she has an ability to communicate what is happening on resources such as CNN and on perspectives that are coming from her family and her friends back home. And I think one of the things that she finds very important is that she understands that people in her community may not be able to communicate with people such as us as peace builders, especially as scholarly peace builders, because they may feel intimidated by the words that we use and by the language that we may speak. And one of the things that was very interesting about not only Don't Call Me White Girl, but also, Stanley Tookie Williams and some other people that I know is that they understand that through their lived experience, they are able to break a boundary that some scholars may be unable to break because they're not able to relate to the conflict at hand. They may only understand it from an academic perspective and things of that nature. So in today's age of urban peace building and digital storytelling and podcasting, I think when it comes to peace building, it is very important to go to people with very much lived experiences, but to also be open to a language that may not be spoken amongst us on a regular basis, because with podcasting today, they're not using academic language all the time. And another example, I'm not sure how I am on time, so feel free to let me know, but with another example that I wanted to pull was from a podcast that is based from my hometown, Dover, Delaware. It is called Untrap the Podcast. And what is important to me on that podcast is that these are people that I actually recognize from my community who have direct experience with things such as incarceration, things such as, death, especially the death of youth within my community, youth that I know in my community, and they're able to also use their platform to give light to how that actually makes them feel as people. Unfortunately, I had a hard time deciding on whether or not I wanted to present those two podcasts because of the language that they may use. However, I would suggest that people go and check them out if they are looking for a perspective on how urban issues do affect the people in those communities, because they do have something to say, and they are also doing something that is I find very interesting, which is they're talking to other community members about the issues. So just to bring it back to Untrap the Podcast, for one episode, the host, who's named KP, he brought on a football coach, his youth league football coach, who is very well known within our neighborhood. And he asked him the question of how does he feel when, he coaches these kids and then he may get a call one day, understand with the news that they have either passed away or have become incarcerated. And I feel like that unlocked a very different conversation around urban peace building and the urban perspective. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah.
No worries, Bernice. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for continuing this conversation. I already have 20 questions just from hearing the first two, but we do have two more, and so I will pause and hold my questions, but would strongly encourage folks who are on the call with us to be writing down your questions, your thoughts. We will have time at the end to kind of be in dialogue with one another. But before that, we do have two more folks that we want to hear from. And the next is Carrie. And so Carrie, Dr. Carrie McInerney is a senior research fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Carrie co-leads the Global Politics of AI project on how AI is impacting international relations. She is an AHRC BBC New Generation thinker, one of the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics, and one of computing's rising stars under 30. Carrie also co-hosts the Good Robot podcast, which is on feminism, gender, and technology, and she recently co-edited 2 books, one called Feminist AI and the other called The Good Robot, based on her podcast, which is about why technology needs feminism. Carrie is also the co-author on another forthcoming book called Reprogram: Why Big Tech is Broken and How Feminism Can Fix It. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Carrie.
Well, thank you so much to all the presenters. I found this really, really stimulating, and I can't wait to hear the rest of the presentations. Will, I have some slides that, if you don't mind sharing, Will, that would be fantastic. And I think my audio should be embedded into the slides. And so hopefully we will. Oh, yeah. Okay. This is working. So yeah, thank you so much for that kind introduction as well, Will. So I'm Carrie, and I am a researcher, but also a science communicator. And so a lot of my work is thinking about how do we take academic research that often is very siloed, that often is, not communicated or translated very well to wider audiences, and make it into something a bit more punchy and accessible. While most of my work does focus on technology, there's very strong connections to thinking about urban peace building as well, which I'll explore. But the reason why I think it's particularly important to think about this theme in relation to tech is because so much of the news or narratives that we get around AI in particular, but the tech industry more broadly, is very much propagated by a small number of tech actors. And one of the reasons why I think media and podcasting and digital storytelling is really important as a way of being able to tell different stories about technology, both as a way of being able to illuminate the kinds of harms that we see emerging with new tech, but also to look at different ways of imagining technology and what it can be. So that's what we do on the Good Robot podcast. We ask this, slightly tongue-in-cheek question of, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? And we try to encourage our guests to share with us what they imagine good technology to be. And sometimes they just say no, which is also fine. But if you go to the next slide, please, Will. Brilliant, thank you. And so just to provide a little bit of background, why we've particularly leaned into digital storytelling as a way of getting people into this conversation. And so myself and my colleague, Dr. Eleanor Drage, who run the podcast, work across a variety of mediums, from social media like TikTok through to more conventional things like radio. And the reason why we do this is just because so much of the research that we produce is very focused on academic publishing. And while in computer science, there's significantly more access in terms of, say, things like online materials than there are in other disciplines, a lot of this, is still very much cloaked in the language of academic research. It can be a little bit hard to understand. And it also requires a huge time commitment from people to say, if I even am able to engage with this language, I have to sit down and read this 10,000 word paper just to try and understand something. And our work with everyone from community activists through to the engineers and computer scientists who are building the programs, through to teachers who want to know what to say to their students about these new technologies, all came back with the same question or the same problem, which is we just don't have time for that. And so as someone who is a full-time academic and researcher and does have the privilege of a lot of time, myself and Dr. Eleanor Drage thought, well, what can we do to make this more bite-sized? What can we do to make this something that people can integrate into their daily commute and listen to when they're walking home or taking the tube home here? And so that's why we started looking into other forms of research communication, particularly digital media. Next slide, please. And so something that I think has been really special to do over these past few years is thinking as a researcher about this kind of interesting pipeline of producing academic research, which is then co-produced as a podcast or in some kind of audio or visual form. And then actually recently, as Will mentioned, we've now turned those podcast episodes into a book of short essays with a lot of really beautiful science fiction illustrations. Again, all with that goal of saying that people consume and understand information really, really differently. And so one of the major focuses of the podcast itself is accessibility around who, not just in terms of who is able to partake in academic discussions, but also around, who prefers to learn through an audio format, who prefers to learn through a visual format, and how can we better try to accommodate people's different learning styles and needs in these conversations around technology. And so that was just kind of like a broad framing for like why we started this podcast, like why we think it's really important to be engaging and work around science communication. But now I want to talk a little bit more and share some examples of the work that we do in relation to peace and peace building. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of different ways that the work that we do on the podcast intersects with the main themes of the call today. I wanted to highlight two and then bring some kind of voices from the podcast to share about these. So the first is thinking through these ideas of gender and security, or women, peace and security, and specifically through the lens of cybersecurity. So as someone who's very much thinking about applying feminist principles in AI and tech development, a problem that I run up against time and time again is that people still often think about cybersecurity through what I would argue is a very masculinist frame. And so they're often thinking about what does it mean to make sure that our technologies are secure from an outside hacker, rather than thinking about all the different ways that technologies might be repurposed for violent ends. So particularly gender-based violence or forms of coercive control. And so in the next clip on the next slide, you're going to hear one of our podcast guests talk about this exact problem in relation to smart home technologies and how those are used often for the purposes of domestic abuse and coercive control. So next slide, please.
We consider most threat models to be about external actors, with external being, a person that is not in this perfect environment and tries to invade this perfect environment. But as any intimate partner violence scholar, any gender studies scholar, any criminologist will tell you, the perfect household does not exist. And the domestic environment is not all happy and loving. And there's often, fights, there's harm, there's harassment, and there's violence. And so it's important to also account for the internal threat actors that sit within your own system. And technologists do that. They think about internal threat actors, but then they are employees. And employees are different because you have different mechanisms to act against them because they're not on the same status as, for example, the employer. Whereas in a domestic abuse environment, we do not want to have these discrepancies and authority levels. And that's something then a designer has to account for, that not everybody has the same abilities and the same access often to the systems as they envisioned them in the first place to be and to have. So basically, I think it's important that we model different scenarios and account for them and make a decision nearly like you do when it comes to ethics application, for example, in a research environment.
Yeah, so what I really find helpful about Leni's research and perspective, and also what she reflects on broadly throughout the episode, is that she takes a very narrow example, thinking about smart home technology, but uses it almost to shine a light more broadly about how we think about safety, how we think about violence, and what it means to create technologies that can be meaningfully peaceful. Next slide, please. And then the second facet I wanted to foreground that I think comes out in a lot of our podcast episodes is thinking about how technology, and particularly violent and carceral technologies or surveillance tech, shapes urban spaces. And this is something that comes up time and time again from our interviews with activists, with researchers, with academics, who are all trying to think about what it could mean to have more just and better technology. And often that means firstly prioritizing kind of community justice, so moving away from individualized models of privacy to think more about, you know, again, what kinds of technologies will create just and more safe spaces for everyone. But then also thinking about the kind of global networks of surveillance and how in a global tech industry, we can't think about one country's tech production without thinking about how that has ramifications all around the world. So first, if you could go to the next slide, Will, we're going to hear from Jen Lee from the ACLU.
Another example I think of are technologies like automated license plate readers, or ALPRs, which are used for law and parking enforcement, as well as for traffic management purposes. And this may seem innocuous to many folks, but ALPR technology is a powerful location tracking tool, and thus was a key technology used by the New York Police Department to illegally target the Muslim community for over a decade after 9/11. Using this technology, the NYPD mapped where members of the Muslim community lived, stationed cars with this technology outside of mosques, tracked worshipers attending services, and placed the names of thousands of innocent New Yorkers in secret police files. And while this surveillance program was ultimately struck down as illegal, it placed unwarranted stigma and suspicion on the Muslim community.
Thanks, Will. And if you could move to the next slide, then the second person to hear from is Dr. Matt Mahmoudi from Amnesty Tech.
The way that Red Wolf works is that the system operates at checkpoints that are necessary for Palestinians to pass through in order to access things such as education, work, medical services. Oftentimes you'll have situations that we heard about through our testimonies in which, say, families that need to get access to an ambulance have to first pass through a checkpoint. The ambulance can't come through to their neighborhood. It has to wait outside the checkpoint. And they may find themselves in a situation in which the soldier doesn't let them pass unless they're friendly with them or for whatever reason happens to know them and act in good faith. By introducing an algorithm at the checkpoint, you're removing any form of that sort of human leniency that might have existed in the first place. So what we're witnessing is a Palestinian coming into the checkpoint, which is catered only to the Palestinian. It's not for use by Israeli settlers. It's only for Palestinians, whose face is being scanned the moment they walk in through a turnstile. A light indicator shows up on a computer screen by the operator. It might go green, in which case you're lucky you can pass through. It might go yellow, in which case oftentimes there's either a bug or there's simply not clarity around whether they should let you pass you. And if it goes red, which is what you're hoping it doesn't, you're dealing with a situation in which either you haven't been biometrically registered yet, in which case the soldier will lock down both turnstiles and you will be coerced into producing an ID to be matched with an image that was taken of you in the first place, so as to train the system to be able to pick you up in future. Or you may have been scheduled for detention, for questioning, or for whatever else that you are unaware of. But crucially here, people's faces are registered into the system without their knowledge and consent. Folks rock up to the checkpoint. They have no idea how they're known, how they're being recognized. They don't know the soldier, but they're being addressed by their name and their details.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So yeah, this was again just like a very quick whistle-stop tour of like the kinds of conversations we're having over at The Good Robot, at the podcast. And I wanted them just to kind of set the scene for this wider discussion around how we're all engaging with and using these forms of storytelling in our work. And so I'm going to wrap up there in the interest of time, but I'm really looking forward to everyone's Q&A and also, yeah, hearing the rest of the presentation. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Carrie. And with that, we're going to move on to our final presentation for this discussion before we move into the Q&A. And so again, please feel free to be writing down your questions and we'll have time to jump into them after this last presentation. But without further ado, I have the privilege of introducing Kamaya Truitt. Kamai is the Director of New Talent and Community Partnerships at WUNC, North Carolina Public Radio. Kamaya is WUNC's first director in this role, and she began her journalism career at the station back in 2012 as a youth reporter. Kamai has produced radio reports on national broadcasts on NPR's Here and Now, as well as Oakland Youth Radio. By creating and developing new school partnerships, she was able to launch WUNC's first virtual youth reporting institute. The evolution of the institute doubled student involvement and expanded the program to reach across North Carolina. Through this program, Kamaya trains students how to record, write, and produce their own radio stories for broadcast. Her purpose is to intentionally carve out a platform that will amplify youth voices to tell stories that matter to their communities. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Kamaya.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for that. I wish I could just have this on recording and play it whenever I'm meeting people for the first time, because that would be great. Sorry if my internet starts glitching, because I'm seeing that it's doing it right now. And if it does, I'll just stop sharing and talk. So I'll be looking at the chat for a flag. Wonderful to meet everybody. As Will said, I am WUNC Public Radio's Director of New Talent, Community Partnerships, and Youth Reporting. I'm actually going to start off with a story myself about how I entered this realm, because I think it sets up the reason why I've formatted youth reporting in the way that it is. So I actually met Will back in 2012 as a disgruntled teenager who had a lot of angst about moving to North Carolina and a lot of stories to tell. He funneled that, along with my help, into some really great poetry. I ended up on WUNC Public Radio doing a really nice Terry Gross impersonation, and the program director at the time was like, "You need to come here." So I pitched my first story, which was supposed to be about how gang life serves as a community space for people who've lost their parents or key family members, and how they kind of uplift each other. It was through this storytelling process that I got radicalized, because that was not the story that came out at the end of the day. It was hard for folks at WUNC at the time to digest what I was trying to communicate, because that's not how they view community. Gang life is an awful thing, and we should be encouraging people to not be in gangs. And so my story was diluted, and it turned into this kind of cautionary tale instead of, this is how the community is coming together to create solutions for the issues that they're facing. It made me start to think about how many other stories have been diluted or not produced or demonized because they didn't fit into this status quo. And it had me talking to the program director at the time about, what could youth reporting be? What are the new iterations of what we can focus on? How can we intentionally uplift those voices that have been previously marginalized, that have been previously determined not newsworthy because they don't fit the status quo? So in 2013, I became a mentor in the program and realized that we need to start branching out a little bit outside of our listener base. We were getting a lot of students that lived in Chapel Hill. They already had their life planned out. They had the grants. They had their parents were in academia already. Not to say that they didn't need to share their stories, but a lot of their stories were being shared already. So how do we tap into the folks who aren't heard of because they don't talk, like they don't understand, they don't have the education? Well, we start getting inside of the schools and we develop a community to radio pipeline. We specifically focused on Title I schools because that's usually where the most underserved people are. And we started these training hubs, these little cohorts within these high schools and local HBCUs. From that, we were able to create this equitable situation, equitable curriculum that encouraged more people, more students, more youth of color to come and share and trust that we would hold their stories and present them in the way that is authentic to the experiences that they had, which is a big component of YRI. Without equity, without trust building, YRI doesn't exist, because we're entirely youth-led. The youth create everything from the curriculum to the stories to the digital rollout of all of their stories in a way that will directly talk to the people who haven't been listening and resonate with the people that are wanting to hear themselves, hear their experiences in public media, something that wasn't happening at North Carolina Public Radio in bulk. I'm getting a little excited. This is something I like to talk about. Sorry, let me take a breath. So yeah, we started to remove the barriers to entry in journalism so that youth could have more access and a platform to tell their stories, and confronting traditional journalism standards like truth and objectivity. What does objectivity mean in a space where we're always only hearing one side of a story? How can we change the narrative and change the perspective, not to take away from that side, because, you know, sometimes there are two sides, but sometimes there's 50 sides, right? And you need to be able to create space for all of those sides to breathe, all of those sides to be valued. That's really what it is, to value all of those perspectives. And then that starts with building trust. This little picture right here is of one of our youth reporters from last year, Manzili, creating a short TikTok, because we started to go into the digital creative space last year. She's creating a TikTok about land equity and the gentrification of rural communities in Southern North Carolina as a way to, one, easily disseminate her story, two, connect with people her age, and three, hopefully connect with their parents. Because the one thing that we learned when we first launched this was, you know, we originally thought, okay, the youth creating media for youth, only youth are going to listen. That is not what happened. We learned that a lot of these students are living in intergenerational households. So the stories that they're producing are impacting people on different levels in different spaces. They're telling their parents, their grandparents, and they're going to the bingo hall and telling their friends about it. They're going to work and telling their colleagues about it. And so now these information and these narratives are being spread in ways that we couldn't have imagined, and in ways that our traditional reporters just simply didn't have access to. And the funniest thing about all of this is, at the inception of youth reporting, we heard that we couldn't put youth voices on air because people will turn it off because it doesn't sound like traditional radio. It's too jarring of a transition and they won't listen. What we learned was people tune in more because it breaks up the monotony of radio, right? And it tells stories and narratives that you wouldn't normally hear unless you listen to This American Life or All Things Considered, you know, in these niche pockets where you're going to hear some quirky or what they deem quirky, but is real life, real narrative news. And so all of these things led to this beautiful audience feedback loop that we were able to create, well, community feedback loop, because a part of this is not just equity, it's not just trust, it's that talk back that creates this peace in this space, because you can't create peace with somebody, you can't build trust with somebody if you're not in constant communication with them. So we have these students here for 8 weeks. We're learning about not just the stories they want to tell, but their lives. We're meeting their grandmas. We're eating dinner with their families. The subjects of the topic of the stories and the guests that they bring on, we're connecting with them for 8 weeks too, because, you know, we have a lot of time to produce these stories. So we're able to invest greatly and then push the story out and then bring them back in to speak to the audience that listen to them through these things that we do called listening parties. I think this entire cycle is how we show up in the city. It's how we build our peace. It's how we create that trust and keep everything equitable. I think the biggest demonstration this year of building that entire cycle was through our student Paris Smith. She produced a story with the help of Talik Alexander about how he's transitioning and what that experience is like, the violence that trans folks face, and how he's creating a community to combat that. Well, I actually have it loaded in here, so you don't even have to worry. I'm gonna just go ahead and play that now. Hopefully you can hear.
These stereotypes and transphobia turn into real violence, and the violence is increasing. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, the murder of trans people nearly doubled from 2017 to 2021. And if you're Black and trans, the risk of violence is much higher.
When you check a lot of boxes, as far as Black, as far as trans, as far as disabled, or it's scary to live in the world that isn't made for you.
In spite of this risk, Khalik made the choice to transition to stay alive.
My transition was about my comfortability. It was about making the decision to live, because as a girl, I didn't want to be alive, to be honest. I just hated who I was. So it was like, why stay alive if I'm just going to hate the body that I'm in?
I apologize for not giving a trigger warning beforehand, because that definitely was supposed to happen. So my apologies across the board. But throughout the production, and also throughout the production of this piece, because it was so sensitive and it took a lot of time to get these intimate interviews, it really demonstrated the level of care needed to create a landscape where digital storytelling can equal peace building. I don't think that access alone to Khalik and the relationship between Paris and Khalik was strong enough to just, for him to explain all of this, for him to invite her to a photo shoot where he's celebrating his third birthday. It was the time. It was the time. It was the trust. And honestly, it was the knowing all of the components. Khalik became a collaborator in the process. And I think that's also a big component. I want to go back to something that Nikki said earlier about the power of sound and scene. Well, setting scenes with your sound. What does that do to the overall narrative of a story? How are we using our senses to bring the audience into this space was something that was key in this. You know, not everybody knows what it's like to grow up in a Baptist church. That's where Khalik grew up. Not everybody can understand, you know, what that type of influence is on in your life as you're figuring out your gender and sexual identity. How do we communicate that? How can we put you in that space without any visuals? Was a beautiful, difficult challenge to take on, but something that I think took this story and all of the stories that we have to the next level. Yeah, I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry, guys. Sorry if I'm rambling. How much time do I have? I'm okay. Okay, 1 minute. Last thing I'll say, I'll just summarize it. You know what? The way that WUNC-YRI uses digital storytelling to build around peace is through solutions journalism. I think that's the cornerstone. We hear these issues all the time. The students are tired of hearing the bad things about their communities. What are we doing about it? The communities are actively joining together. How can we amplify that without diluting? How can we advocate while still keeping our journalistic integrity, or things that we're confronting? How can we value and center the experts of their own experience? Like Bernice was saying, there's a lot of people that don't have the scholarly backing, but are very much academics in their own right. How can we pass the mic to them more? And how can we pay these people for the work? Because that is the biggest thing. People need to be paid. You don't need to just drop in, get the story, dip out, and say you did a good thing. You need to keep talking and keep paying them and valuing them for the things that they're contributing. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Kamaya. That's a powerful kind of closing word there. How can we pass the mic and pay them for their work? That combination of things. But a huge round of applause for all four of our presenters, Nikki, Bernice, Carrie, and Kamaya. Thank y'all so much. We're now going to kind of pivot in towards a Q&A session, but I want to pass it back over to Arthur with maybe to get us started off with a reflection and perhaps a first question. But I would encourage folks who are in the audience with us, think about your question. Feel free to type it into the chat. You'll also have an opportunity to raise your hand directly and to share your question. But before that, I'm going to pass it to you, Arthur.
Wow, thanks, y'all. You have given, I think, all of us so much to think about. And I'm someone who loves synthesis, and this even stretches my mind past the points of like trying to bring together we've this all together. But I can say this was just hugely valuable, and you brought up so many different issues. One, this theme of lifting up knowledge that comes from being deeply rooted in place, in culture, in a historic experience, and honoring and kind of highlighting the knowledge that people are willing to share, and in the language that they like to use to share it. And so I think that is such an important part of this. When we think about cities, right, we have so many different kinds of embedded knowledge communities. And, you know, part of the way that we can think about what the city is and should be comes from finding ways to listen more deeply and lift up people. And so you have given us some specific examples of that. Kamaya with that cautionary tale and like her radicalization process through where that fell short. Vernice with the examples you gave with your with the podcast that you listed in your own experience and how it's been meaningful to you. Also came up this idea of the built space too, especially as it relates to like cyber security and how we're being surveilled in the space, and even devices in our own home, and the built space of our cities, which is such an important kind of component of it. And the fact that we're in new territory and similar power problems, but new territory. And so that raised the issue that that Carrie talked about too, about the responsibility the other way. To take, people are doing specialized research, they're doing stuff, they're getting paid to and have opportunities to access information. How do we have that flow back to people, and in this case to people in cities, in ways that can be supportive of them trying to navigate violence in their own lives, love, opportunities, livelihood, all of that kind of stuff. So this kind of moves in both directions. And Kamaya, that was really helpful, kind of more holistic view about participation, landscape of peace building, really about participation. And I think Nikki kind of was checking off some ways of helping us think about, well, how do you sculpt that participation in terms of the craft of it, thinking about like sound, texture, and those pieces. And Kamaya kind of in the pedagogy of it. How do we connect with people? How do we build durable community? How do we root this in relationship? How do we build it into our organizations in ways that stay after we go? So with all that said, here's my kind of question. And my question is the desire of the question is to leave a pretty open palette. But if we look back kind of on cities in a way over millennia, we see that there's a kind of dynamic process between like central planning and how people then use and rise up and navigate the cities. So, you'll have a community that does a guerrilla gardening in a spot that, the land was unclaimed, and it becomes, that's what it is. Or the city, kind of puts a sidewalk somewhere, but people use the path. And over time, that sidewalk gets removed, and people are able to kind of speak back to their built architecture. At the same time, cities can build things that are really, really useful and help people connect when you have affordable buses. And ways of connecting with each other, when cities make even clean water available to all. I mean, these have been really transformative moments. So there's a tension. Let's think, in best case, in a creative tension between the city as it's planned and how people experience it, and then ways of participating and turning cities into what we want them to be. And each of you, the theme that I heard there is each of you had, I think, a kind of platform that's like digital media provides pathways for participation. And for me, as somebody who doesn't regularly create digital media, when I'm thinking, and as an educator, I'm doing a lot of place-based work and those kinds of pieces. So I think for each of you, for those of us who are out here who are not in the regular of this kind of component of this work, and we think about the kind of a step in the creation of the cities that we want to live in, cities that work for more people, is there a kind of a kind of tip that you have, or a kind of space that you think is really valuable, or something that you've seen where you think that digital media, maybe it's like untapped potential, or or ways that media can be used to kind of to deal with the issues that we're experiencing, both the challenges in the city, and turning the city into what we want it to be. So how can we, those of us who are either get involved or have some kind of ideas about what we can do as peace builders, to kind of incorporate or use some of this stuff, or even just think about some areas where it could be really helpful?
I was going to say, I think that it's important for the cities to kind of recognize what direction they want to take it and the effect of that direction, because at least from what I've noticed is that there are a lot of times where cities may they want to bring peace within the community, and they want to make that community safer. However, I think what's important is that when talking about the direction that they want the community to go in, I bring it back to my point of talking directly to the community members and the natives of that community, and involving them within that conversation. Because there are many times where, the city may have an idea, or figures in the city may have an idea of what the city needs, like a new park, a new neighborhood, or even like a new road. But what tends to happen in some situations, the people in that community may be disregarded from those discussions. And because of the vision that the city has, their livelihood may also be at risk also too. So I just always say it's best to talk directly to the community about their experiences and what they feel would benefit the community the most, in the way that they're able to afford also. So
thank you. The floor is open.
Yeah, I mean, I would just love to second that. I think that's really important, because I think it's something we see so much in tech development, as well as people deciding what kinds of products they think we need, as opposed to actually surveying and asking community, what do you really require? So, like, to give an example of this in the UK context, there's a lot of excitement right now around medical applications of AI, and for better and for worse, this is certainly like a growing area of AI applications. I remember talking to a friend of mine who is a children's doctor working in a hospital, and she said, "Oh, so what do you think about all these, like medical AI tools?" And then she kind of laughed at herself, and she was like, "I don't know why I'm even asking you that, because my hospital still uses paper notes, so they don't even have digitalized note records. So whenever she needs to prescribe for someone, she has to go and look through like a physical huge set of files and rifle through like thousands and thousands of patient cases." And she says it's amazing that there aren't more forms of negligence, or there isn't more harm caused by this paper filing system. But I think, unfortunately, like, this is the story of so much tech development. I think it's also the story of like the smart city as conceived, where, yeah, again, like, you have a lot of excitement around tech and kind of this branding of a lot of tech development as a sign of modernity, a sign of progress, without actually thinking about whose modernity, whose progress. Are these things we should be trying to valorize, and are these things that are actually going to benefit communities, or are they just going to be costly, environmentally damaging, and then, in 10 to 20 years time, something that we regret?
Do any of our other panelists want to come in on this? If not, we can also open the floor. Leah Tudor has a hand up. Leah, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. So I was trying to type out my question, but it was getting kind of long and I wanted to just articulate it a little bit better. So considering that a lot of times with digital storytelling and the peace and conflict context, we're dealing with marginalized communities. How do we ensure that these digital platforms are reaching communities that don't necessarily have access to digital or like technological advancements?
Thanks, Leah. Any of the panels, please feel free to jump in.
We ran into this question with the launch of our TikTok. We were trying to figure out ways to reach the Latinx community just a bit more, but we didn't have the utilities to have a reporter that could translate. We didn't know how to build like a WhatsApp thing. So I think it goes back to what Vernice said. We brought in the community and asked them, what are without phones, without, internet access, what's the easiest way? Magazines, right? Like newspapers at their local shops, at the grocery store, flyers on this like physical posting board at the laundromat were the things that they suggested, things that we didn't think about, at all, because the space is just, everything is so technological. But yeah, talking to the people, because they're talking to each other, right? Like they're sharing information, they're building together all the time without broadcasting it everywhere. How can we be direct? And the best way to figure that out was talking to folks. Now, broader, right? We're based in Durham. There's a big community in Beaufort that listens to us, but that's like 200 miles away. We're not driving to Beaufort to post up there. So it's definitely a barrier and a question that we're trying to creatively think around, but the people know, is what I'll say again.
Yeah, maybe I could just come in. Oh, sorry. No, Leah, you go.
I just want to say thank you. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, Alea, unless Will, you wanted to say something as well. I was just thinking, I've been listening here to the reflections and the comments, and then Leah, your comment as well. And so I live in London. I'm not from an urban environment. I'm from a rural environment, and it's a very different upbringing compared to growing up in a city. And I was talking to Will before this in terms of, actually for me in the urban environment, my experience of it, and acknowledging my positionality here as well as, a white British person living in London, is that actually the digital has been like a huge barrier sometimes, and particularly like in a London context, right? Like you don't talk to people, like you should not talk to them. And like you plug in your headphones, you get on your commute and you don't talk. Actually, the areas where my engagement so far, where it's been kind of bringing people together in a city space, is actually when we've removed the digital, ironically enough. And this goes back to another piece of work that I've just been working on, is that when we go back to just the power of conversation, right? I mean, you can still see that as communication, and particularly in the city when you actually get people together in these groups. And I think there's been statistical studies done as well on the power of talking to a stranger and the endorphins that releases, and how happy you feel when you've just spoken to somebody that you didn't know, right? Or interacted with somebody that is not necessarily normally within your periphery in terms of your work or your friendship group. And so actually, and it goes back again to what I said at the end of my presentation, as much as we're kind of advocating for the digital within, urban spaces, is that I equally think that we shouldn't lose the root of where communication came from. And if you look at the root of communication, it's in dialogue and conversation, and you don't need the digital to do that.
Thanks for that, Nikki. Any other questions? I think we might have time for one more. If anyone in the audience has a question, a reflection, you can type it in the chat or you can raise your hand. Yes, Ashton, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So this is kind of piggybacking off of the previous question. I don't know if this is true, but sometimes I get the sense, and it's maybe just because I'm in my own echo chamber, that podcasts are kind of like a liberal thing, that people who, listen to the New York Times, the Daily, or, all of these bits and pieces. And the more I was reflecting on, the role of community engagement and conflict resolution, I was thinking about how could a podcast, and this is focused on urban peace building, but how could a podcast kind of bring different perspectives into the same room without necessarily creating contentious, it's almost like a safe vessel to be able to air different sides of a conflict without necessarily creating a hostile environment where people are talking directly to each other. And I was curious if anyone had come across instances where a podcast has been a useful forum for helping people talk to each other without actually talking to each other. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems like an interesting platform for being able to facilitate conversations that we might not be able to have because they just get too heated too quickly, and then we're stuck in a space where, I have to, conflict resolve this kind of gnarly, discussion that I just got myself into. Anyways, thanks for taking that question.
Thanks, Ashton. Any of the panelists have some thoughts on using podcasting to kind of bridge these sorts of the divides, to talk to one another indirectly, as it may be?
Go ahead.
No, go. I just thought.
Okay, this is just another example that I got from, again, the Don't Call Me White Girl podcast. So she actually appeared on Untrapped, the podcast, and she actually spoke to the host KP. And one of the topics they actually spoke about was closeted homophobia within the urban community. And one of the things that Mona kind of brought up was that, surprisingly, there are a lot of closeted men within the urban community. However, they just don't want to come out because of the culture surrounding, homosexuality and things like that. And KP and his co-host had, they were not combative. However, they were open to hearing that, but they did say their boundaries with that topic right there, and with that having a friendship with someone who may be, closeted or even openly gay. But basically, from that discussion, what you can actually see is how they were both very open, because they both are aware of each other's ideology, but they're also aware of the fact that they both are able to relate to each other too, just as people who both have like the same background. And I know that's a different context from what we may see within peace building. However, I think it's very just important to kind of create a space where you're able to relate as human beings rather than trying to relate in terms of ideology. And I think that's how people should kind of approach those kinds of conversations, even if they may disagree with the person opposing them or not. So
I'll just make this really quick. T.S. Madison has this podcast called, what is it called? Maddie in the Morning. T.S. Madison is a trans woman. She's very loud about it and advocates for LGBTQ plus rights all the time. This came out around the time when Beyonce's album dropped, and at the same time, you have to be deeply entrenched in social media to know this, when Miss Netta and Charles came onto the scene. And there was a lot of conversation around how older LGBTQ plus folks identify themselves, how they speak about the LGBTQ plus community, and how sometimes it can be seen as something detrimental and setting folks back because they aren't using the right language, they aren't addressing them with the right pronouns, but they're coming from a place of love and peace. And it was this beautiful discussion that they weren't talking directly to each other. I can't remember who it was, but Miss Netta and T.S. Madison were speaking about this idea and the pushback that they were getting online from Miss Netta not identifying herself in a way that is easily digestible, and T.S. Madison talking about the issues that she faced during transitioning. And I think it hits that that question, Ashton, of dealing with this conflict where you're not having to resolve face to face, but you are getting to some sort of resolution and understanding about people's different experiences in a space where everybody can be heard. I'll drop the link in the chat if y'all want to check it out.
Thanks so much, Kamaya. Carrie, did you have your hand up as well? Did you want to come in with the last comment?
I did, but I know we are right on time, so I can also hold my comment.
Well, maybe on that, yeah, it's been an insightful and stimulating 90 minutes that went by in the blink of an eye. I've taken feverish notes, and I've learned a lot, and I'm quite inspired to listen a lot more, to check out some of the resources y'all shared. A big thanks to the Carter School and specifically to Amber Williams and the Peace Week team for making all of this possible. Thanks to Artie Romano and the Program on Urban Peacebuilding for hosting us. And most importantly, I want to give a huge thanks to our panelists, to Nikki, Bernice, Carrie, and Kamaya. If we could all give them a round of applause wherever we may be in the world. Thank you all so much for joining us and spending your lunch hour if you're on the East Coast in the US, or if you're in the UK like me, your early evening. To close things out, I do want to pass it back over to Arthur for one final word though before we wrap up.
Well, just want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise, and for all of you who joined us. And I dropped a link in there. If you want to stay in touch with the Program on Urban Peacebuilding, please do. Follow these great folks' work. They're doing, I know I copied all the information down myself, and hope to see you in September for our next Peace Week. Take care.